This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So, across the course of the 19th century, around 10,000 missionaries were dispatched from Britain to the so-called dark spaces of the world, as evocatively shown in this pictorial missionary map of the world from 1861. Their mission was to spread the light of the gospel, to civilize and modernize non-Western peoples, and to ultimately hasten, or at least prepare for, the second coming. Missionaries were the grassroots mediators of the colonial encounter, working through cultural, political, and religious interaction and exchange. In the process, they pioneered the field of anthropology and ethnography, shaped the dynamics of the world's religious demographics, and formed an active part of what we might call the Empire Project's cultural wing. And this image that's just come up is a good demonstration of that, with the slaves of Sierra Leone going from naked and degraded, in inverted commas, to clothed and in Western-style houses, as all missionaries would have desired. Over the last 20 years or so, it has become increasingly clear that mission activity was a crucial part of Britain's colonial and global encounter, and allows us as historians of empire an in-depth insight into the dynamics of the so-called contact zone. So begins every one of my many job presentations over the last 3 years, and I hope, well, it seems to have been successful. I have had some employment in that time, and happily don't have to give it again after this for a while, thanks to Kent. Here, I'm preaching to the choir, but wait. Despite this revitalisation of mission history, historians of Christian mission have been reticent about approaching the missionary and his or her family as a legitimate subject for analysis in their own right, due in no small part to a continued discomfort with the hagiography and heroisation of earlier generations of missionary writers. It was some time ago now that Thomas Biedelman advised us to take an anthropological approach to the history of missionaries themselves, their lives, their families, and their communities. Meanwhile, recent trends in colonial scholarship are reminding us that we need to pay attention to both sides of the colonial encounter, that is, both the so-called coloniser and the colonised, if we're to really understand the dynamics of colonialism and imperialism in the 19th and 20th centuries. Missionary Families, then, is an attempt to do just this, to take the missionary family as a legitimate site of historical analysis in its own right for the first time, not necessarily as a vehicle to a better understanding of public history, but as an important venue for historical analysis itself, for us to really understand the cultural and colonial encounter at its grassroots, and more broadly the role of intimacy, affectivity, and personality in the writing of history. So this is the point in my job talk where I then talk about how wonderful I am, and innovative and interesting and the best thing since sliced bread and so on and so forth. I'm not going to do that now. Rosemary did it for me, so you should have come with me, Rosemary, to all those interviews. That would have been helpful. The truth is, I undertook this research because I found it interesting and I love researching missionaries. But interview panels and funding bodies don't like to hear that. They want to hear that it's going to revolutionise the field. But luckily for me, it sort of did. I can't say it revolutionised the field yet, but it certainly changed my way of understanding missionary history. So doing this kind of intimate and personal history has actually brought me to a better understanding of the public history of the missionary enterprise. And many of the debates that we've perhaps become stuck on over the last few decades are, I think, can be resolved or at least refreshed by paying attention to the role of the family itself. Looking at the missionary family helps us to think again about missions and race, the role of the missionary wife, and the rise of the civilizing mission, all apparently well-worn areas, but ones where the historical debate has had a tendency to perhaps grow stale. At the same time, this perspective can open up exciting new avenues for study and analysis: missionary masculinity, the importance of life cycle and generation to the history of Christian mission, and the role of missionary children, often silenced by official bookkeeping, in the global Christian endeavour. Missionary families were ubiquitous in the mission enterprise, and it seems that everywhere you turn was a smartly dressed family performing the role of ideal Christian household, usually in delightfully absurd petticoats and starched collars in tropical climes. But their ubiquity in later years should not lead us to assume that their involvement with the missionary endeavour was always intended. In fact, the white missionary family, as we have come to know it, was the result of negotiation and compromise between missionaries in the field and the LMS, or the London Missionary Society, who I looked at in this book, in London, whose ideal missionary in the early years of the enterprise was actually young, male and single. Thus, if single men went, counselled LMS Director Thomas Hawes in 1795, which probably will be most desirable to begin, they would do well to form matrimonial connections with the first converts of their natives, especially with those connected with the superior families, who would thus, receiving them into their bosom, be more engaged to protect them. I should note here that my footnote to that quote in my book is wrong, much to great embarrassment when I came to do this talk. Maybe I shouldn't have mentioned that, but anyway, now you know. Not only would intermarriage entrench early missionaries into indigenous communities, but further, if the labours of the missionaries were not crowned with immediate success in the conversion of many, a very few families established would offer a seed to be brought up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and probably equally taught both language of father and mother. Children of mixed racial and cultural ancestry, then, were to be an asset to the mission and could extend the scope of Christianity and indigenized Christianity from within the local community itself. And of course, the most famous, successful example of that is James Reed Jr., son of the famous missionary James Reed Sr., funnily enough, in South Africa, and his quote-unquote Hottentot wife. The missionary enterprise, then, was built upon an ideal of what in the book I've called integration, based upon an optimistic expectation that conversion would be swift, and a parallel belief that white women were essentially nothing but trouble to the missionary enterprise. They would be unsafe on the wild frontiers and, more importantly, would cause, quote, anxiety, trouble, and attention from the male missionaries. Thomas Hawes, again, thought it very important that a missionary, as far as possible, should neither be engrossed in labour nor his attention distracted and his anxiety exercised about his own or his family's provision. While Richard Lovett, writing around a century later, declared that originally the idea was that the Christian family would be an educative and helpful influence to the natives, this reflected his expectation of missionary family life more than the initial wishes of the London Missionary Society. So this was the first finding, if you like, of the book, and came as a surprise to me. I don't know if it's surprising to you. I have been talking about it for about the last 7 years, so it might be less surprising at this point. But it obviously speaks very clearly to the missions and race debate within existing missionary literature. The London Missionary Society and its missionaries had no explicit issue with interracial relationships, which were in fact encouraged, and no clear articulation that racial divisions should be strictly upheld, unlike later on in the enterprise. They did have a protean sense of cultural division, however, though this was expressed through ideas of religious similarity and difference, rather than through ideals of Western civilization. Thus, intermarriage was fine, but only in the Lord is the dear apostolic order. Marriage had to occur within the confines of Christianity and Christian conversion and baptism. It was this rule, and early missionaries' complete inability to stick to it, that would lead to the more assured rise of the white missionary wife, as we have come to know her. So what changed for evangelical missionaries? How did this early vision of optimistic universalism, embodied in the very intimacies of family life, fall by the wayside, as we in this room know it did? One of the main reasons that integration as an early form of missionary practice did not survive, as I've alluded to, was the behaviour of early missionaries themselves. After all, the LMS had given them only one rule, that you had to marry within the confines of Christianity. Conversion was key, but what they hadn't expected was indigenous people weren't really that interested in Christianity. They had assumed they would flock to convert, but indigenous people, funnily enough, didn't necessarily see the attraction of this new spiritual and cultural system. Individual missionaries then began to break the rules, marrying and indeed cavorting with unconverted women and testing the boundaries, therefore, of evangelical respectability on what I've called the spiritual frontier. In the Pacific, numerous missionaries tested these boundaries, with more than one running off with local women, some in order to marry them, others not, some trying to force them to get married, and unsuccessfully in most cases, as you can imagine. After all, what is cleverly disguised in this painting, you can just see them all lurking behind this very respectable married couple, is that most of the early missionaries to the Pacific were young single men. The average age was 24. There were 31 missionaries dispatched, of whom only 5 were married. And what is only alluded to here is the apparently unique temptations of the local women, naked, sexually free, and in the words of later missionaries, if above the age of 12 years, likely to be debased. Is it any wonder that transgressive sexual relations soon ensued? In the end, the LMS resolved in 1804 that if any of the brethren be strongly persuaded that his stability and usefulness, you can read your own interpretation of those words, as a missionary at Tahiti would be promoted by his entering into the marriage state, he be advised to return to England for that purpose. English, read white, marriage, became the antidote to missionary deviance in the South Seas. In 1809, 4 pious women were dispatched from Britain with a direct view to intermarrying with the missionary community that remained single. And I could never remember where I read this, but I definitely read that they had to choose their wife by drawing lots of which one they would marry. In South Africa, it was the emergence of a racialized colonial culture that spelled the end for missionary integration. A later generation of missionaries turned against integration as demeaning to the missionary character. The missionary character is not to be brought down to Hottentots, but his character raised to the missionary, argued the most vociferous critic of integration in South Africa, George Thom, who was also an LMS missionary. His critique demonstrated the growing missionary internalization of an emerging settler colonial culture that was constituted increasingly through the prism of demarcated racial boundaries. 3 missionaries have Hottentot wives, he said, which has lowered their character in the eyes of the farmers and indeed the whole colony. It cannot be expected that the manners and sloth of a Hottentot will improve a missionary, and he can never take her into any family. 2 extremes should be avoided, particularly with Hottentots: too much familiarity and too much distance. In league with a number of his missionary colleagues, Thom eventually engineered the so-called South African Synod, a convention... No, come on in. Oh, cliffhanger. What happened? Start again. In league with a number of his missionary colleagues, Thom eventually engineered the so-called South African Synod, a convention of LMS missionaries opposed to intermarriage, which met in 1817 and ultimately exposed numerous missionary immoralities, including adultery and extramarital affairs and children born out of wedlock and all sorts of things, which my supervisor, Andrew Porter, said I only alluded to in a very coy manner in the book, which was actually a word count issue because they did so many bad things there wasn't room to actually describe them all in the word count. These mission immoralities fundamentally undermined intermarriage as an institution in itself, brought down by the propensity of its proponents to stray outside acceptable evangelical behaviour, and an emerging discomfort in both the mission and the imperial world with interracial relationships of all kinds. So some mission historians have talked about, or Richard Price in particular, the closing of the missionary mind. And what we can see here, he kind of imputes that to missionary frustration with indigenous peoples not converting, which is true, but we can also see that this was also a result of their own behaviour in the early enterprise. If having white missionary families in the field was supposed to improve relationships between missionaries and the local peoples, this it certainly did in many cases, but it also served to consolidate ideas of inherent difference, and particularly when missionaries began having their own children, no longer the mixed-race community of budding indigenized missionaries, but now a highly cloistered generation of white, petticoated children. These images are my favourite from anything I've ever done, particularly this one, which he looks so cross, don't you think, in his petticoat? Yes, he. This reminds me of a picture of me, which if I'd been more organised I would have found from home, where I'm wearing a little bonnet and I'm like, get this thing off me. I think I would have also had a good picture there. Missionary children could be a great boon to the enterprise, providing a normative example for the local peoples to follow, aiding their parents in their vocational work, and ultimately it was hoped becoming missionaries themselves. But missionary parents were hardly exemplary, and fretted continually about the temporal and spiritual futures of their offspring. It was often when thinking about their children that missionaries indulged in the worst kinds of missionary prejudice. After all, as Alexander Simpson wrote in 1833, bad native habits are so exceedingly contagious for young people. Missionary children became segregated from the local people, undermining the importance of conversation and contact embedded in the missionary vocation. No parent is able efficiently to attend to his family and the duties of the station too, wrote John Osmond in 1826. And Osmond was superintendent of the South Seas Academy, which was the school founded for missionary children on Tahiti, with a direct view of keeping them away from the local people. The children will therefore have learned everything that is vile before they come here. Here is all to tempt, and few, if any, barriers to gratification. It is therefore of the highest importance that the children be taken as soon as possible away from the gross absurdities of the peoples, and from a sight of those base practices to which the younger part of the community are addicted. Missionaries thus slid away from humanitarian universalism, which stressed the equality of all peoples before God, and which was crucial to the ideological underpinnings of evangelical conversion, and moved towards a more essentialised view of indigenous peoples. The problem came when even the, quote, indiscreet and excessive kindness of the converted natives was highlighted as troubling. Converts were supposed to be always equal to missionaries. As they became problematic because of their contact with missionary children, it highlighted the fractures emerging in missionary discourse in terms of this universalism that was crucial to their own enterprise. So that's children. Where do missionary women fit into this tale of missionary families? If one of the themes in mission history that this book deals with is missions and race and the rise of the civilizing mission, the other is the thorny issue of female missionary professionalism, a controversial term in itself. White missionary women became mainstream in mission culture through the collapse of early ideals, and we've seen that in the Pacific with the LMS saying, go back to Britain and marry there if you want to promote your stability and usefulness. This was not the fault of the missionary women, of course, but it did mean that their entry into the field rode the tide of the civilizing mission, whose emergence chimed with female missionary action and this changing tide in missionary discourse that I've described. Individual missionary women, meanwhile, found it extremely difficult to balance their vocational yearnings with their domestic duties. In other words, to fit in mission activities around the cycle of child-rearing and domestic chores. As eloquently described by Elizabeth Price, talking of her mother Mary Moffat's early life as a missionary's wife. One great trouble was the kindling of a smoky wood fire upon the flat hearth, and I've been to Kuruman to see the hearth, and it is indeed smoky and flat. Bending one day over this, her sickly babe wailing, and after trying in vain with blurred and smarting eyes to get it alight, she burst into tears and said, "Is this the sort of work I have left home and friends to spend my life doing in this uncongenial heathen land?" But she heard a voice from within, "Ah, if I may be the hewer of wood and a drawer of water for the temple of God, am I not still blessed and privileged beyond words?" This, my mother told me, was a landmark in her life. She renewed her vows and went forward with fresh hope and courage. Some historians have seen that as women falling back on the idea of helpmeet in order to make sense of their lives. In the book, I argue that it's a much more active thing than that. It's not falling back, it's rather changing missionary practice to fit with their own abilities and therefore have agency within what has been described by some as a patriarchal institution and system. Interestingly, it was not just missionary women who were frustrated by the secular work that was becoming implicitly involved in their spiritual vocation. They undoubtedly bore the brunt of it, particularly once children were born. And missionary families were large, so take these examples from the main families in my book. You can only just fit them onto these family trees. By the way, this fellow on the right, William Crook, was not magic and did not have these children by himself, although that would have been quite biblical. In fact, there's no picture, unfortunately, of his wife, but her name was Hannah Crook, formerly Hannah Dare, and she has a journal about which there is much in the book, so you'll have to buy it to find out more about her. Nonetheless, men too could lament their inability to pay sustained attention to the spiritual in the face of their domestic and secular demands. When Robert Moffat began his missionary career at Afrikaners Kraal in southern Africa, he lamented the attention he had to pay to his domestic affairs, despite a, quote, wish to have almost nothing to do but instruct the heathen. I am carpenter, smith, cooper, tailor, shoemaker, miller, baker, and housekeeper. His son John, too, complained about the practical demands on his time. There was something ludicrous in the contrast between the theory and practice of missionary life, he wrote. The missionary in these barbarous regions must often turn up his sleeves and plunge into something very unlike a pulpit, content to be a hewer of wood and a drawer of water for the temple, using the same words his mother used. Obviously, it's a biblical quotation or allusion. So, the Moffat men knew how to whinge, I think, is the conclusion we can come to here. And probably one of my favourite quotes in the books is Robert Moffat complaining about his disarray in his linen. And he has no patience. There is always confusion among my linen. It's a hard life, isn't it? I know. Some years later, however, it was Robert's daughter and John's sister, Bessie, who can always be relied upon for a good quote, who put it most succinctly: the husband is jack of all trades and the wife maid of all work. And I've included these pictures of their mission stations to drive home the point that clearly they spent most of their time building and making these kind of Western entrepôts in the middle of the so-called heathen wilderness. And this took up a lot of their time on the spiritual frontier, which is why the spiritual frontier is distinctive, I think, to more urbanised areas of mission activity. I've enjoyed giving missionary women a voice in this book, but I've also enjoyed exploring the idea of missionary masculinity and how male missionaries understood themselves as men, particularly as husbands and fathers. But here is the double blind, with little personal evidence speaking to what mission husbands and fathers thought of themselves in that context, and a complete lack of public reflection on what it meant to be a missionary father and a missionary husband. Nonetheless, in the mission context, masculinity was strongly connected with notions of family. Not only did their ability to rescue wives and children and attention to a wife's welfare exaggerate the missionaries' chivalric heroism, as Esme Cleal, one of our own, has argued, but the family was also a source of male authority. As Catherine Hall has noted, the missionary's role in the family enterprise was closely linked to his fatherhood: head of household, father of the family, father of the congregation, father of the children in his schools. In short, male missionaries' family identities constituted and consolidated their professional identity. Well, I'm running out of time, so for more on that, you'll have to buy the book. See what I did there? Cliffhanger, missionary masculinity, exciting times. But I'm just going to draw together a short conclusion. So I've not been able to give you a full summary of the book, but what I hope to have shown is the way that, firstly, missionary families were an integral part of the missionary enterprise, framing every aspect of the missionary experience. And secondly, that paying attention to missionary families as an analytical category gives us a fresh perspective on mission history as a whole. Which brings me back to the overall point of the book, though I don't think I quite realised that until after I had sent the final manuscript. But never mind, I'm saying it now. which is the importance of looking at the affective, the personal, and the intimate in order to promote a full understanding of history and encounter. We should never forget that history is made up of what Andrew May has recently called trivial and minute actions and real people making real choices. Everyday history still has much to teach us about making history meaningful in the modern and postmodern context. Thank you.